When last we left our party, they had just discovered several stunning things which had started to have a rather severe emotional impact upon one of the characters, Psionic, who had just learned of the name of her race, the Scions, and had just discovered that several million of them had died in some kind of catastrophe that had happened within this facility uh, almost 4 centuries ago. I forget the exact year. I wrote it down somewhere. And given the information they had found, they discovered that there was a third facility. And based on the information they had found, they deduced that what had happened is someone, most likely Airfall, had come in and created, woven, the first facility and to an extent the second facility, the outer gardens and the domicile and the fortress, into what they were. And the outer gardens was designed to function directly off the elemental ley line which this entire island sits on, so it would be maintained for all time, basically. Whereas the fortress and the domicile required an actual living individual to help funnel and channel that energy in order to keep the facility running, which is why the place was so decayed. They discovered through the notes and through their investigations that there was actually a third facility that the people here had crafted on their own, which they found a teleport pad linking directly towards, which they then opened. They quickly did some experiments to make sure they could get back, and that they could link it directly to the hub within the garden, which they could. And this place was much cruder and rougher. It's very clear that whoever made this place did so through much more mundane means. It was basically roughly hewn rock that had just been carved out in order to make space for where places could be, for people to work and stuff. After entering the facility, they went a short ways and found that the whole facility had sort of like a this sort of thing. I don't even know. There's a square pathing going around the facility, and there was like this one quadrant over here, then there's this quadrant, then there's this little section, and then the final area, which I'll get to last, of course. Now, one other thing, I may be divvying this video up. I haven't decided yet. It depends entirely on how long this takes to decide. I have actually had some of my players wonder how long it would take, because we actually spent over 2.5 sessions in one room within this facility. But I'll get to that in a minute. The first thing they encountered was an area where they were researching enforced physical limitations through magical means. Specifically, the individual who had run this place, Mandakir, Magistrate Mandakir, had insisted that while the magical protection that this island was afforded through whatever means, this has been implied already for obvious reasons, but they never actually have, even to this date, have never actually narrowed down exactly what it was that was magically restricting this island. Anyways, um, in addition to the magical barrier, they wanted a physical barrier in order to segregate this island from the rest of the world, such that it would be, safe and provide a sanctuary for the people who lived there. So he had devised a way to sink the island within the ocean. This is why this island is several hundred meters below the sea level, and there's those massive waterfalls. Several of the other things they find out here is that there is something of a system in place to deal with anything that does end up physically going over the edge, even though it technically shouldn't be capable of doing so. They never actually find out what, but there is a system in place that they had developed in order to deal with such problems. That's basically all they found there, except for one additional thing. As I said, I tend to use technology terms in order to describe things within a fantasy setting, because it's easier for my players to understand what I'm talking about. This is a system that is basically designed to interact specifically and directly with the mind because of the way the scions function and the way their technology works and the way their magic works. And so they were sifting through this thing, and they came across the ability to reach in and go further than they should have, or further than their access should have allowed them to, and basically hacked their way to the point where they found an option to revert this. Now, the option to revert this was permanent. It's not a switch. It's not, no, no, no. If they were to raise the island was going to stay raised. The only way to sink it again would be to basically research the method to sink it again all over again, and then somehow manage it with reverse engineering and virtually none of the talent or individuals who had been involved in the original project, and only bare notes with none of the actual scientific or magical details necessary in order to do it. So in other words, long story short, while it is at least feasible that eventually they could resync it, after the course of a great deal of effort, and if they convinced an entire team of people to work on it constantly, the idea here is that if they raise it, the island is going to be rejoining the rest of the world physically as well as magically. Um, they decided after extensive length, Furnace here was initially in favor of going ahead and raising the island for several reasons, but as the two debated it, they both decided that given the hostile political situation that's going on right now, especially between Redoran and Telvanni, and the fact that it's not just their decision, there's a lot of other lives that are being affected by this choice, obviously, they want to at the very least consult someone and try to get some kind of official bearing on this before they do something hasty. So they left it there as an option. They, in the next, as they continued over the corridor into the next little quadrant here, they found a rather large research laboratory. This whole area is called the research facility, by the way. Mandakir's research facility. The next area they found a lot of work. They found pieces of what on physical inspection looked like materia, but upon magical inspection or appraisal they discovered was not. It was something that was either designed to imitate materia or was an attempt to create materia, and after some extensive looking, they determined that this was someone trying to artificially create materia, which is something that has been, a gold out of lead kind of dream for a great deal of time, even amongst the citizens of this island. Um, they did take one particular piece of fake materia that in Flux's opinion, had actually gotten close to succeeding at this task, as either for information for the future or as a souvenir, take your pick, and decided to move on. There was really nothing else they could determine from that. But based on the two pieces of information they have so far, it became very clear to the party that Mandukir had created this facility specifically because he believed the defenses that were already in place for the sanctuary, for Visay and Lascelles, were insufficient against whatever it was that they were so afraid of that they fled here from. Which was an interesting point. The next area... the next area was interesting. They came across a door that was different. It wasn't a door so much as the walls had grown into covering this area. And keep in mind the walls are just solid rock, really. But there was an indicator there that says all it requires is a blood sample to unseal it, not to open it. Upon unsealing it, the very first thing that happened was plumes of smoke came out, and a great deal of heat hit the faces of both party members, and they were both very worried at first for obvious reasons. They went in and found that this place looked like it had been nuked to cinders. Someone had come in and set off what looked like a firebomb. There was charred ash everywhere, and for the first time bodies, and obviously there were bodies within the pods in the first area, in the first facility, but here we had skeletons that had been charred down to the bone, and only a few tidbits of anything had survived this area. They did find a few journals of a written nature, which they then took and tried to determine anything they could from them. From what they understood, the people who were in this area, it was a living area. It really was. It was just like a little dorm. Well, not a dorm, obviously, but a barracks, except not military. And these people had been subjects in some kind of experiment regarding artificial materia. And that's all they were able to find out at this point. They did find several pieces of artificial materia here that had also been charred to cinders because they weren't actually materia, so they, weren't protected from the fire. After considerable looking into the situation and from information they found later on, they deduce that either whoever had come through here recently had nuked this place out of spite, or the area had been sealed immediately after the fire had been set off in such a way that it was completely sealed. Sealed almost within time, if you understand what I mean. Perfect stasis. So, and simply being in the room was giving them a very bad feeling and making them cough and choke, and it was very acrid. So they decided to leave and reseal it as they left. Then they came to the last facility. Where are we at time-wise here? Where are we at? That's only 10 minutes. I'm going to keep going. When they went to the final area, they found a single door leading into a small little room, which had a single one of the panels they keep encountering throughout throughout the various facilities, and space for something in all corners of the room. The panel contained journals from Mandakir himself. As they read them, Mandakir seemed to descend into raving lunacy the further they got into the journals, to the point where he was just ragingly paranoid and screaming fits, that kind of thing, raging about how everyone was against him and he had, blah, 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 things like that, right? And so, based on everything they'd seen before, they got the very distinct impression that Mandakir had been someone who was a delusional psychotic, had some issues, and had been doing experiments he probably shouldn't have. Then they went to check out the other room. Now, the other room was a door, okay? Just a physical looking door, but as they reached for it, all that would happen is their hands would go through it, okay? And anytime they tried to pull their hand back or anything else back through the door, there would be resistance. Now, they were very cautious with this door, and well, they should have been. One of the first things they did, I'm not going to go over all the experiments they did, because they did many in order to determine exactly what went on here. But for example, he would put a belt in because he wanted something organic, or at least formally organic, so leather, right? He put the belt in and then tried to pull it out, and there was a degree of resistance as he pulled it out. And as he pulled it out, and he did an examination of the belt, it looked like it had aged or decayed or something, quite a bit, a noticeable amount more than simply, the belt existing would have been. So, okay. Then they tried doing that with several other pieces of items, and eventually he wrapped a piece of leather around a piece of materia, one of their expendable pieces of materia, tossed it in, came back out. The materia was completely untouched, no change whatsoever. So, okay. Next thing they decided to do was to go ahead and try. Our green mage, Flux, decided to summon his Earth aspect. His Earth aspect showed up, and he said, "Go on in, Earth aspect." Now, a summoner of sufficient skill, which he is, can see and sense and hear through the aspect's form as long as it's within a certain radius, even if it's not in line of sight, if you follow what I'm saying here. So he could see the inside of this room for the first time. Now, this room was even more bare and even more basic than the rest of the place. The rest of the place was. There were what I like to describe as claw marks, even though that's not actually quite accurate. If you could picture something, I don't even know if you can see me. Let's pull up my view here. There we go. If you could picture something that had made solid black streaks like this, but they weren't traditional claw marks. If you know what actual claw marks look like, they go like this, right? And you could see the clawed edges. This was just black streaks like this, all over the place, all over the walls, all over the ceiling, and all over the floor. And simply being in there, his aspect, Fox was his name, the name of the aspect, felt extremely uncomfortable. Now, over the course of the next several minutes, as he does several more experiments with Fox in there, Fox started to get, as I'd like to describe it, feral. It was a very slight thing, very subtle thing, and it was very slow. But over time, Fox just started to get more and more, just dissolving here. I'm trying to think what else he did in that particular period of time. Again, I don't want to cover all the experiments he did. But in the end, oh, right, he did two other things immediately. He took something that was magical, which in this case was one of his healing kit tabs, and tossed the tab in and watched what happened. He also did this with a potion. In both cases, the magical essence of whatever it was, in the tab, in the case of the healing kit, and the potion within the bottle, both started getting unstable to the point where the bottle actually was shattered by the potion bubbling out of it so violently, and when the potion landed on the ground, it just started vibrating there in one spot and bubbling and doing all this weird things. Not in any given pattern, but it wasn't actually spreading out like liquid should. It was just staying right here. Similarly, the tab broke into chunks of rock and bit and whatever, and started just kind of vibrating on the ground. Never stopped, actually. And so he was like, okay. And he did a few more experiments trying to determine what he could see in the room. He determined that there were 8 portals in the room that Fox could see visually, one for each of the 8 elements. And anytime Fox tried to approach any of the portals, he was violently rebounded, like to the point where, just reaching out to touch it would push his whole form back towards the center of the room, okay? Based on everything they'd seen so far, and of course, Flux was relaying all this to Fear Seal as he was discovering it, they determined that this was probably some kind of prison of sort. In the Raving Journal, there were mentions of obtaining a shadow to experiment on. Now, they didn't know what the context was of that. They don't know if Shadow was a species name or a class or a caste member, whatever, or a derogatory term. But they surmised that that is what this room was. It was designed to keep whatever a shadow is within it. Now, within about a total of 20 minutes pass during all these investigations. At that point, pretty much to the minute, Fox started screaming, just this constant, unending in the back of Flux's mind. Flux immediately desummoned him, so he would get out of the room. Oh, by the way, forget to mention one other thing. Fox, the Earth aspect, the summon, went to leave the room and was unable to, even trying with all of its strength. The door, which again is, as I've already alluded to, was basically just an illusion for whatever is actually there, was completely and utterly impenetrable. It didn't even vibrate at his attack. Could not get out, but he could desummon it, so that got him out. Next thing they decided to try, and they debated this back and forth quite a bit. They decided one of them had to go in there. Flux finally volunteered himself, while Fear went back to check out the panel back in the research uh, uh, the panel, the room that's right next to it. What's the term I'm looking for? The research laboratory, I guess. Even though there is no laboratory, it's just notes. But anyways, whatever. The office. There we go. The research office. Flux went inside, and upon entering, he realized two things very quickly. One, he could not actually see any of those portals that Fox could. Literally could not see them. So they were not visible to a spectrum to him that they were to his aspect, which was interesting. And two, as he tried to interact with where he remembered the portals were, because he remembered, there's a portal right here. This is all that happened. All it was he'd push himself up against the solid rock of the wall, except for one spot. The portal that he remembered coincided with air, with the air element. When he pushed up against that rock, I want to again look at the camera so I can get the right visualization here. Where's my notepad? I've got a bunch of notes from tonight. If this is let's get the right angle. There we go. If this is the edge of the wall, what would happen is he'd push. That's still not the right angle. There, he'd push through, and it would just barely be able to start going into it. If you see what I'm doing here. And he could push into it like it was morphic, it was viscous. But the thing was, after a certain point, he felt that there was resistance that was pushing back against him, and so as he pushed in further and further, it got to a point where he couldn't, and he was incapable of. However, he did feel something as he did so, a very great malevolence. Now, Flux decided to do a lot more experiments on it, which, like I said, not detailing. Finally, he decided to go re-examine the research office, and he summoned Fox in there. And sure enough, what he saw was 8 portals within there. He surmised that these portals linked to the 8 within the room, and so he wanted to do some works with that. So finally, after a great deal of discussion, and it took a good deal of convincing both the player and the character, he finally convinced Fear Seal to go into this room. Now, both of them by this time are already theorizing that whatever this shadow thing is corruptive. That's something they've seen on several occasions and I've already illustrated. And this is something that the journal mentioned as well, that he was afraid of its corruptive nature. So they're obviously a little bit worried about this and think that it is possible that what happened to Mandokir was he was gone loco because of some seeping influence from this thing. Now, I mention that because Fear Seal goes in and immediately just does not feel well at all. She doesn't see the portals. What she does see is writing on every single surface of this room, okay? Writing in the Psionic language. Now, Psionic language is, of course, obviously you can see it, but it is written directly with the mind. I've described that before, where you kind of put the mind up against whatever it is you're interacting with and, right? Actually, I don't remember if I described that on the blog, but I described it to the players a number of times. Surely that counts. Um, but anyways, that's how they tend to write and work with their technology in this case. And so she ends up looking at all these writings, and she's an intelligent character, and she rolls a successful int check and determines that they are formula for the maintaining of the room. That is to say, that writing is part of what is maintaining the room in the manner that it is, if you understand what I'm saying. And if the writing were to be changed, that would change the nature of the room. Now, I don't remember the order in which these happened, but I do remember that she ended up looking at the. She was specifically asked to look at the writings that was near the air portal. And after some very careful examination and some successful roll checks, she determined that whatever had been written in a certain section of that portion of the wall over here was written in a different manner. Obviously, all of this stuff had been written by different people. She could feel the imprints of dozens upon dozens of different minds from all this writing, but this one section was written differently, of a different style, of a different nature. It wasn't as formulaic, it wasn't as scientific. You follow what I'm going here? The pattern was different. She couldn't tell anything other than that, but she could tell that there was something wrong with that section. Now, she then failed a will save. And I'm saying it like that because I want to describe to you in the same manner I describe to my players, in as much detail as I can to get across the point what happened. I told her, the player, that she needed to start playing her character as irritable and angry. Not a lot. Not, but it needed to be a noticeable difference in her tonality. And she needed to do that consistently until I told her not to. So she got out. No, she didn't. She then, Flux decided to do one more thing. He decided to try and send something through one of these portals into the room to see what would happen. So he took another tab from his healing kit. He used it up like 5 during the course of his experiments. And put it through the portal. And what happened on his end is this little visual representation of what's happening popped up. A little view screen, basically, where he could see the room. And he saw her standing there. And a decent period of time passed, several seconds, at least 30, I believe I decided on. And all of a sudden, this spike about this big of solid earth came zooming out of the thing and hit Fearnacil, and she took some damage from it. Flux was like, "Oh my god, I'm sorry." Literally ran into the room and was like, "Oh my god, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I hope you're okay," and got her out of there. Now, her wound was interesting. It was actually rather grievous, all things considered. And even though he was able to stop the bleeding with a significant heal check, the wound remained, if you know what I mean, and it still hurt. And so she was, as I requested, very irritable and very angry with him. And he was like, "Oh God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean this." And as the two were discussing what happened, she bit at him one last time, and he finally said, "Look, I'm very sorry," and gave what I like to call a sincere apology. I decided that was a good enough cue for a second will save. She succeeded at this one, and then immediately I told her, "Okay, you can start acting normally again," which she did. Now Flux, the character, picked up on this change in mood immediately. Obviously, he probably assumed that this injury was the source of her change of mood. But the fact that she so immediately switched back to the normal Fearnacil he's known for the last 20 years was something that was noteworthy, and he brought it up, and she denied it. Now, here's the part where I want to describe this specifically. From her perspective, she was acting completely normally the entire time. From the character's perspective, Fearnacil's perspective, nothing was different for her. She was acting just like she always does from her perspective, even though it has been pointed out to her, and even though she has memories of the events. From those memories, nothing was different for her, even though it is proven that something was, and she understands that and she acknowledges it. It's one of those instances where even when it's pointed out, you can't see it, if you follow where I'm getting, and that's important it'll be important later especially, but it's definitely important now. So, at great length, they did a number of other experiments, and they determined that the way it worked is you would put in if you put in a mundane item, that is to say something that is non-magical, and something that is organic, because it couldn't be inorganic, what would come out the other end is something that is representative of the element but has no magical tint to it, okay? The uh, and again, he did a lot of experiments here. Not that I'm complaining. I actually thought it was really cool. But the net result was those items that came out were healing to those who shared an affinity with that element, which, as I've mentioned before, is something very few people do. But he did go ahead and get some water that he got from the water portal, because Fearness Heal is water affinity. Gave it to her, and it mended the rest of the gash of the wound, and she got her health back. You know, the HP she had been down. And he learned this basically by having Fox stand in there while he tossed items in, and Fox caught one of the earth chunks that he had sent through a non-magical organic item, and Fox, it literally absorbed into Fox without him meaning to, and Fox felt great. Oh, I feel a lot better. And that's how he determined it was a healing nature. But if you send in a magical item of any kind, what comes out is something that is deadly, something that will cause injury to whatever is living within the room. And if there is nothing living within the room, it will stay within the center of the room. It will literally home in to the very center of the room and stay there for several minutes before finally dissipating. Now, he ended up doing one beautifully amusing test where he was like right at the door, and he's like, "Okay, send the thing in," and it came in and zoomed right at him, and I was like, "All right, you're gonna have to make a reflex check," which he did make in order to leap back behind the door as the missile is zooming in on him. But anyways, the whole thing determined basically, in summary, this prison was incredibly well designed, was incredibly well built, and there's two very important points here. One, the feeling of corruption and malaise that you have within the room, that both of them felt. Fear Nacille especially. When she got out, she almost doubled over and vomited because of the sheer difference. It's like if you've ever been in a sauna or a hot tub and immediately leapt into a pool, the sheer shock of it was just, oh, it got her across the knees. And so the total lack of any of that corruptive influence in any of the other places they've been in, including the rest of this facility, led them to believe that they were wrong, that Mandakir, unless he started going into the room, had not been influenced by this. Number two, she and this, I credit the player of this, I can't believe she thought about this, realized that that alternate writing I mentioned was also present somewhere else, in the journal Mandakir had back in the panel. She came across the absolutely brilliant idea, and I can't believe she thought of this. This is something I had planned for. Again, as I've mentioned, improvisation and planning are both important in jamming. This is something I had planned for, but never imagined they would actually do. She went in, and with all her knowledge and with all her skill, went up to the wall and did the writing thing. This meant she had to go into the room, so she had to do a will save just to succeed at getting to this point, which she passed. Got to the wall and started rewriting it. Now, this served two very important functions. One, it repaired the room. Because something was wrong. Oh, right, I'm sorry, I didn't even mention that. They determined that of the 8 portals that were in the office that lead to the prison, the air portal was not connecting there. Whatever the air portal in the prison was leading to was not the office. It was leading somewhere else. So, of course, this managed to repair it, but it also gave me a brilliant opportunity to give some exposition. You see, when you do something like that, and you're actually interacting to try and revert something that has been psionically created like that, you are connected with the minds of the individuals involved in a way in which they cannot lie, if you understand what I'm saying. So she got mental images of the last few minutes of what happened prior to this writing, as well as a couple of seconds thereafter. What happened was all these people were working together. This is all the first time she saw Mandokir, okay? Saw his mind, basically. And he was very calm, very regal, very serious, and very dedicated, which is a complete antithesis of the raving madman imagery they had earlier from the journal work and from their own assumptions. He had a lot of people working with him in this facility. All of them were very dedicated, all of them were very professional, and there was a great deal of teamwork and unity that was going on, okay? They were all scions, obviously. I shouldn't have to say that, but just in case. Now, one of the few, she sees this for a long time. It's this buzzing beehive thing going on, but it's very orderly, very organized. And then she sees someone enter this room, which nobody does, which nobody ever does. And the guy comes up, and he looks like just all the others until he puts his head up there to rewrite part of the wall. And because you can't lie in such a manner, she sees what he really is, or rather, I should say, what kind of person he is, because he portrays this mindset of someone who is just like the rest of them, who is with the team, who is a part of the team, but there is a malice and a almost crude hatred about him, and she realizes his intent immediately. What he was doing was rewriting that section of the wall in order to reroute the air portal within the prison in order to lead somewhere else. And they determined very quickly, after I finished describing these events to them, that the direction he was leading this portal to was Airlinth, which is the island of that was crafted from an air elemental ley line. Now, in case I haven't made it obvious, this guy was actually being attacked this entire time as he's rewriting. This guy had basically consigned himself to death to open this prison so that this creature, whatever it is, could get out. She never sees it. She actually can't see it, even in this particular mindset. But it is attacking him, and he is literally dying as he's rewriting this thing so that it can get out and escape to Airlength. Now, he is discovered very quickly, but he does successfully finish rewriting it and ends up, he's slumped against the wall. He's in his dying moments. She sees Mandakir himself rush off because, if you'll recall, earlier in the second facility, in the throne room, there were 4 orbs, one for each element, and the air, fire, and water ones all said no communication at the other side. The assumption there being that he could use those in order to communicate with the other 3 islands, right? He rushes off to do that, and because they found his debris on the chair, they know that whatever happened, which I'll get to in just a moment, happened as he was on that chair, either immediately as, or prior to, or immediately following him, warning Airlength about the fact that a shadow had gotten loose. Now, what she sees then, and I want to describe this as carefully as I could, because I did it to her, to them as well, is all of them wink out. All of their minds, which is what she's seeing, vanish just like that, including the gentleman who is sabotaging the thing. Now, at first, they're like, well, that's weird. Clearly, it's the saboteur who did that. But then they start thinking about the situation. The saboteur himself had certainly malicious intent, but what he was doing was rewriting the portal in order to sabotage the other island. And indeed, he succeeded at that, obviously. The last thing she sensed was the shadow moving through the portal into the air ley line. I forgot to mention that, didn't I? I'm sorry. These 8 portals that are from the office that lead into this prison, they don't actually go directly there. They go from here directly to their given ley line and then back here. In other words, these are directly connected to the conduits of the elemental ley lines themselves. That may or may not have any impact on you depending on what you think about that, but I loved my players' reaction when they learned that, because the reaction literally was something like this. Are you kidding? Because there's so many implications there. And that is both incredibly dangerous and incredibly difficult to do, especially in my setting. But anyways, let's move on. So whatever it is, managed to get into the air ley line, and who knows what happened afterwards. Upon successfully repairing it, within a matter of minutes, the corruptive atmosphere that had been filling this room continuously ever since they encountered it faded. Without the pipeline of whatever was coming through the air portal feeding it, and yes, that means it was coming through the air ley line as well, for those of you who are picking up on that, it was unable to maintain itself, and so it dissipated. Also, the items, the potion and the healing kit that had been left there, both finally stopped, and just drained out like they normally would, as if there was nothing wrong. Let's see here. There was one very important thing, though. The way that everything happened, it became clear that the guy who was doing the sabotage with the air portal was caught by surprise just as much as everyone else was by whatever it is that winked them out. And it did it all basically at the same moment. And because she could feel the minds of these people, as I've said several times now, she could tell that nobody was dreading this, nobody was anticipating it, nobody was planning it. These 3 things are very important if you think about it from a investigation perspective, because it means this wasn't an attack that they foresaw or were aware of. As in, oh, we could be attacked at any time. There's always that kind of dread in the background. There was none of that. There was no, oh, we're at a state of battle right now, and we need to constantly be on alert for blah. And I don't want to flip you off, and there was no one Yeah, we'll use this finger. Ugh! There we go. And there was no one who was actively being like, "Mwahaha," and I will activate the doomsday device. Nothing like that. These people were caught, all of them, including the saboteur, were caught completely unawares by whatever happened. They then decided to go back. Fiona Seal took a moment to recover because she believed, and indeed was correct, that this is what had happened to her people. The 2.2 million and all the dust, the debris piles they kept finding, all her people, millions of people, just gone, just like that. And they still didn't know why. And they've tossed around a lot of theories. I'll let them just kind of theorize there, sitting there for a while, which I always enjoy it when my players do that. I enjoy it when you guys do it too, by the way, so feel free. Um, I may not answer you because I don't want to, give anything away, but I do enjoy it when people theorize about my stories as they're coming out. So they went back and decided to go ahead and see if they could revert the journal on the thing in the same manner that she had done so with the cave wall. And she succeeded and found out that Mandakir was in fact not a crazy raving loon, but in fact an extremely dedicated, extremely intelligent individual who was desperately trying to find another means to survive. And because they rolled very high on this particular check, they got one little additional piece of info. There was one other journal entry that they barely almost didn't find. That was Mandakir speaking privately, non-professionally, non-scientifically, to himself, basically, just leaving a little journal entry, quietly and privately despairing about the situation and the fact that he believed that there was no hope, that even with all their technology and all their magic and all their power, that there was no hope for them, and that while the islands were a good temporary measure for security and safety, it would not last. And he was desperate to find some other means in order to help them out, and everything he'd tried had failed. The artificial materia thing failed. The artificial infusion thing failed. Speaking of which, they find out what both actually happened with that. I'll get to that in just a moment. And all of the experiments with the shadow, had led to nothing. He had nothing, and in his quiet moments he despaired that there was no way they could survive, and I quote, "a civil war of this nature." Now, this is at this point the second hint that there's anything internecine about the Scions, because the entire nature of the rest of the facility is one that only exists within a society that trusts its own members to a degree that we in real life probably have a hard time understanding. The idea that there is no security, the idea that as long as you are a scion, you have full access to everything, that kind of thing, right? That was by design. So this is the second hint now that there was something going on. The first hint obviously being the saboteur I just mentioned. As I promised, they discovered, he discovered that they had actually quit their artificial materia research before the end because they basically hit a wall. I described it to my players as the concept of breaking the light speed barrier. It is something that isn't even theoretically possible by our knowledge of mathematics, but that is something that we still try to achieve because the imagination can conceive of such a thing. It can conceive of the possibility of going faster than light. It's just we don't have anything fundamentally or mechanically in order to support it. And so that's where they were at. They could think of making artificial materia, they just could not figure out a way fundamentally or functionally to do so. The other room, the blasted room, was where they were attempting artificial infusion of materia. As I described before, materia is infused directly into the soul. They were trying to shove additional materia into the soul in order to try and gain an edge. And as I described to my players, within this setting, the ability to slot additional materia into your soldiers would basically be the equivalent of a super weapon. In military terms, to have an entire army of people who have additional materia slots would be devastating. So that not only didn't go anywhere. One of the people started mutating in ways that I described horrifically, which I'm not going to go into here, um, and it started spreading as parts of him started bleeding off and hitting other members in the domicile. They started mutating too. Something had gone horribly wrong, in other words, and as a last-ditch measure, because they'd been ready for this sort of thing in all the areas of the research facility, they detonated a emergency nuke, basically, in order to wipe out the room, kill everything in it, and then they put a seal on it, a stasis seal, so that it would be locked away forever, basically. It's at this point that both of my players were just like, "Oh my god, can you get any more depressing, dude?" And I have to admit, this is probably not painting a great picture. I'd been building up to the research facility this whole game, really, because this was where the secrets really started to come out. And let's go ahead and look at the time. Where are we at? 40 minutes. Wow. I'll go ahead and stop here, and I will cover the rest of the research facility because there's a little bit additional, and the events of our most recent session, which was actually just last night, when I do my next video. So I will see you guys later.